So this panel will discuss the growing internet issues you should know about before you head to the polls next month. Since the beginning of 2019, there's been a number of major digital announcements affecting Canada's internet, and there's a lot to keep track of. So we want to help you catch up on where we find ourselves and understand what key digital policy issues lie ahead in the election. So on our panel today, I would like to welcome, I'm so sorry for the pronunciation, but Anja Karadeglija, who is the editor of the Wire Report, which is a daily online news outlet that focuses on the Canadian media and telecom industries. She heads a team of journalists on Parliament Hill who report on key political, regulatory, and business developments in the industry. Also, Laura Tribe, who is the executive director at OpenMedia, which is a community-based organization working to keep the internet open, affordable, and surveillance-free. Laura has testified before the CRTC, has appeared before parliamentary committees, and launched a federal investigation into the RCMP's use of Stingray cell phone surveillance devices. And finally, Dr. Elizabeth Dubois, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communications and member of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa. Her work examines political uses of digital media, including media manipulation, citizen engagement, and artificial intelligence. So I think you'll agree this panel will be a good follow-up on the discussions that we initially had this morning with Dr. Kavoukian. Great. So thank you, ladies. So I guess to get us started on this conversation, we all live and breathe this space, so maybe we're all biased, but it does seem like we are hearing a lot more about digital issues this election campaign more than ever before. Where do you think that these digital issues that we're now hearing about fit against some of the more traditional election issues, be they the economy, healthcare, et cetera?
Well, I think it's definitely true that this election is very different from the last one. Kind of in preparation for this panel, I looked up our coverage from the 2015 election on telecom and tech and digital issues, and we had one story, and it was about how nobody was talking about telecom. So things have changed, and I mean, I'm not sure what the reason for that is. I think, affordability is, political parties are picking up on that this is an issue for Canadians. It's something Canadians are talking about more. And, my guess would be is that these are services, wireless, people's cell phones, they're just increasingly integral to day-to-day life. So increasingly important to voters.
Which microphone is this? Is this microphone on? Can I trade with you? Does this microphone work? There we go. I think to your question around how internet policy issues connect with all the rest of those issues, in the work that I do and we do at OpenMedia, they underpin all of those issues. If you're talking about access to the internet and connectivity, in a lot of communities, that's the gateway to healthcare, it's the gateway to education. It's a fundamental element of being able to access all of those services. That said, I don't think that's how this is being talked about in this election. When we're looking at issues like cell phone affordability, it's really being pitched by multiple parties as this issue that gets straight into people's pocketbooks, as a quick thing people can relate to, but it's not really, or I haven't seen anyone really talking about why it's a problem. Why do we actually need to make sure that everyone can afford their cell phone bills? What is the value of ensuring that everyone has connectivity? And although there are such clear connections, we have a community at OpenMedia that is sorely focused on these issues, and even still we're hearing pushback around cell phone bills, but there's much bigger issues at play here. And I don't think that the parties that are even talking about these issues are really connecting why it matters and why people should care.
So just building on that, what are the issues we should be talking about then?
Do you want to go first?
No, this one's not working. So I look at how people get their political information, and so similarly to your perspective, this kind of applies across the board. All of these different issues are impacted by the kind of access people have to information about what services are available, about what different parties think, what their policies are going to be. I think some of the core issues from that perspective need to be not only access to affordable internet cell services, but also things like skill and digital literacy. Those kinds of components really play into some of the conversations we're having about fears of disinformation, for example. And so from my perspective, that's what I've been focusing on. But there are also a bunch of other related issues like privacy concerns, which I gather you all heard a lot about this morning. And so I think that that's another core component.
And actually, I'll also second this question of connectivity. I was expecting, and it might still happen, we're still, relatively early days on, but the issue of rural broadband and making sure that everybody in Canada has access to adequate internet service. I was expecting that to be a bigger part of the conversation, and like I said, it still might be.
I think the other thing that's sort of the big picture is missing from the conversation, not just around why we need people to be connected, but what do we want the internet to look like when people are connected? We saw huge talk 2 years ago about net neutrality. I spoke at a CIRA event about net neutrality and why that matters to people, and it seems like everyone just kind of agreed and moved on. There are huge legislative changes on the table when it comes to the broadcast and television. Oh my goodness, BTLR, whatever that stands for.
Legislative
all of a sudden, thank you. And looking at that and the Copyright Act and all of these rules that oversee our entire internet and communication systems are up for debate. And no one's talking about what they want the internet to look like at the end of that. What do they want the rules to achieve? We're talking about all of these policies and processes, but not what the vision is or the end goal of what we want people to be able to do once they're online. And there's tons of issues around privacy. There's issues around free expression and what people are able to access on the internet and talk about on the internet. Talking about misinformation is something that the parties seem to be completely avoiding because it's an election and it's working to their advantage by all of their different perspectives. And so that bigger picture of what is the world that we want the internet to look like is a huge gap in this conversation, I think.
Are there any parties that are getting it right, or are there any good discussions that are happening, or is it completely absent?
Is this like when you tried to get Anne this morning to pick a winner on privacy?
It wasn't me, it was online.
No, none of them are getting it right. They're each getting it right in different ways, knowing that these are issues that people care about, that we have to talk about. We're seeing 3 of the parties talk about cell phone affordability. Well, that's a piece of the puzzle. So that's the Liberals, the Green, and the NDP are talking about affordability. We're seeing the Conservatives and the Green Party talk about privacy. Pieces of the puzzle are on the table, but we're not seeing anyone actually talk about what the big picture is, I think.
So this is maybe a question for you, Elizabeth. Speaking about the election and voting, in this era of social media and what we've seen happen elsewhere around the world, how does social media and other digital campaigning tools affect elections? And what about things like misinformation and online harassment? How is that affecting elections?
In a lot of different ways is the real short answer. The impact of social media, search engines, and other digital tools has a bunch of different kinds of impacts. And while it's being talked about a lot in this election, it's been the case in the last few election cycles that we're seeing innovative uses of technology, internet-enabled technology specifically, to find ways to connect with voters. And sometimes it's really helpful because sometimes it helps create community and draws people in and offers support and helps to offer mobilization opportunities for groups around particular issues. And we are still seeing that, but we're also seeing the flip side of that where people are being drawn in often with emotional pulls online, and they are being enraged over something that maybe doesn't exist or something that does exist but actually is a very minor detail. But because it can get people really emotional, we end up focusing on that emotion rather than a particular policy issue or an issue that might be a much larger concern.
What do you think the role, and this is a question for all of you, of course, what do you think the role of these social media platforms should be in terms of being regulated, or should they be regulated like traditional publishers, like media outlets?
Well, I'll just start off by saying I don't have an opinion on anything that I cover. So going off that, I did just want to raise that the Green Party, and I think Lauren and I had mentioned this, did have, or I think they're the only ones that have spoken about this, and they have a proposal where they want to make it so that social media platforms would have to verify that you're a real person, so identify you in order for you to be able to sign up for a social media account like Twitter or Facebook. And that proposal on their platform caused a bit of a stir, I would say. People pointing out flaws with it. But so far, I think that is the only party that's actually brought anything like that up.
That is a bad proposal. And I hope I don't have to explain to everyone in this room why anonymity is so critical for free expression. But fundamentally, the groups that we see the most compromised are the most marginalized. The people that need the ability to speak out online are not the people who are comfortable identifying themselves. There's a reason that they're scared, that they're vulnerable, and we need to make sure that there are safe spaces for that. And this is, I'm sure, a very well-intended proposal, but it will have incredibly toxic consequences on the ability of people to speak freely online. And if that is the way that we're going to treat the platforms that people are using the most often, we are going to be silencing the people who need them and leaving space for the people who are comfortable to put their name behind just as much crap. It's not going to fix the misinformation. It's not going to fix the information being circulated. It's just going to mean that only the people who are really, really comfortable in saying it are able to do so. And that's very, very rarely the most vulnerable and marginalized who we need to be protecting. And I think that's such a big issue that cannot be overlooked in how that's on the table. More broadly, I think, no, we cannot be treating social media platforms the same way that we treat journalism. I don't treat Anja's columns and the work that she does the same way that I treat my aunt sharing information and memes online. And those are very different forms of expression. One is journalistic expression, one is freedom of expression and a personal interest. And there's a lot of concerns around what people are sharing, for sure, and how do we make sure that people are informed enough to be able to read between opinions, memes, actual news, and distill that down into information to be informed voters and citizens. But that's very different than implementing widespread censorship to try and treat everyone as though they have to have the same editorial structure as something like the Globe and Mail or the CBC.
So I also think the anonymity thing is a bad plan. And I think that it's really important to recognize that there's been tons of studies done on the role of verifiable identities, and in almost no cases does that actually reduce the amount of harassment or hate speech that people receive or that flows across these different platforms. So it's important to consider that. But kind of going back to the publisher question, the argument kind of started with, well, these online platforms, they are these dumb conduits. They just offer the opportunity for content to flow. And then in contrast, we said, no, well, they're publishers. And there's got to be an in-between. We can't just say it's up to our family members to decide what to post and what not, or to us to decide how to take that on board, for two reasons. One reason is because people just aren't that media and digital literate, and so we need to recognize that there have to be interventions. They could be governmental, they could be from civil society, they could be from platforms, but there needs to be interventions to help people understand how that information system works, which is constantly changing. On the other side, social media platforms and search engines have as their fundamental business model control of information. If we think of all control of information as censorship, we really are in trouble because none of us can actually consume all of the information that's out there or even curate it for ourselves. We need these tools to help us, but we also need to be sure that these tools are designed in a way that it's not incentivizing content that's going to be harmful or malicious, that things like our hate speech laws that already should apply can actually be used and applied in those contexts. Right now, there's a whole bunch of hate speech that happens online that nobody can do anything about because the platforms say, it's not my job to look into that content, and police and other law enforcement officials say we don't have the capacity, and these platforms haven't designed themselves in a way that allows that, and that's insufficient for a democratic country.
Good link back to the privacy by design. You weren't able to join us this morning, but Anne Kawukian did speak exactly about that, about designing platforms and building privacy in her case, but all of these regulations right in from the get-go, from the design stage. So I do want to make sure we take some questions from the room, so I'll pause here in our list of questions to see if there are any questions online or in the room. I see we have one online. So Gary Whitneck asks, does CIRA have a committee or board which is dedicated to formally lobby the Canadian government to legislate as needed to protect Canadians from misinformation and privacy concerns? So I won't ask that of anyone on the panel. So perhaps, Byron, do you want to join us for a second and answer, or if we can get you to a mic. Can we get a mic to Byron? Oh, we'll have a guest panelist here for a second. Yes, so the question is, does CIRA have a committee or board which is dedicated to formally lobby the Canadian government to legislate as needed to protect Canadians from misinformation and privacy concerns?
The short answer is no. There is no committee or board at CIRA that does something like that. We do have, as I think we mentioned earlier, there is a representative from the government in Canada, from the ISED, who sits on our board as an observer. So anytime we have conversations about these types of things, they're in the room listening, but they are not an active participant typically on issues like this. But anytime we at a board level are talking about these types of issues, that person is there.
And I will add that CIRA's opinion is also often sought out by a number of government, whether they be government committees or government departments, as they work on a number of issues, legislative pieces, things like that. So we have a number of opportunities to consult that way too. So yes, there's a question over here.
Hi, yes, just really quickly, I think this is the perfect group of people to ask because you've all had some sort of freelance journalism experience in your past in some way, it seemed like. When you talked about that interesting point of somebody sharing something on Facebook versus something that maybe Anja wrote or something like that, what is the difference in terms of, there's a lot of freelance out there now who are journalists that are writing things, and they're really just personal blogs, but they're branding them and advertising them as facts and things like that. And so how do you combat something like that, whereas you're saying, well, no, it was on this website and it looks like it's journalism, so it must be journalism, when in fact there might be things that people share on Facebook that might actually be more legitimate than some of the things you would find there. So how do you combat and fight those things?
So one kind of point to make, when we were talking about the idea of should these platforms be regulated as if they're publishers, I think that often is talked about in the context of how these companies are taxed, what kinds of content responsibility they have over their content, and not necessarily in terms of whether or not they are supporting freelance journalists and the way that journalists get jobs or don't get jobs and how their content's interpreted. I think those are meaningfully different conversations to be had, both important. In terms of how do we deal with content that looks like journalism as we traditionally understood it, but maybe isn't coming from somebody who went to a J school and was taught journalistic ethics and is protected by an outlet that has a legal team to support them in their journalistic endeavors. And the answer is it's a really murky territory and we don't have a good way of dealing with that. which is why we've turned towards things like media and digital literacy to encourage people to spend time thinking about why did this show up on my screen, who's created it, what went into that creation, and to start asking questions as citizens of the information that's showing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think murky is the right word. Whereas personally, I might find it frustrating if if I see something that is political opinion masquerading as journalism, and recognizing how that differs from what we do, which is we always try to be neutral and fact-based reporting and all of that. But I mean, how do you regulate that? You don't, because then you're starting to get into government censorship, the government deciding what is journalism, and that's a road I personally wouldn't want to go down.
Hi, my name is Lynn Hamilton. I'm the president of the Internet Society Canada chapter, but I'm also the past president of Equal Voice, which is an organization dedicated to getting more women elected. So I'm looking to you ladies for some guidance, because I think Elizabeth May her heart was in the right place, but I don't think it had been fully thought through. We all know that the harsh reality that is Twitter and online backlash specifically stops more women from wanting to take part in the political process. It's a huge barrier. How do we, at the same time as we want to protect women from the kind of vitriol that they get, and it's markedly worse for women than it is for men, clearly, how do we make it a safe place for women to be online, while at the same time making sure that if there's a politician that you really don't like, that people are allowed to say what they want to say about them? Any tips?
You're asking me to defeat systemic racism and the patriarchy with some sort of technological solution, and I'm not sure that we can do that.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yeah.
I'll give it some thought. I think there is no doubt that those problems are exacerbated online, that vitriol exists in person. It's exacerbated when you can stand behind, the distance of your computer screen from wherever and whoever you're targeting. But I think that they are bigger issues, and a lot of the solutions that are being sought are technological solutions to societal problems, and that's where we keep tripping ourselves up, is thinking that some technology is going to fix the fact that there's real hate going on in the world, and we need to fix that. When we're looking at hate speech online, it's hate speech. It's not some sort of weird thing that exists just on the internet. It's hate speech. We have laws about it, and we need to be able to use that. So when we're talking about the police not knowing how to handle these issues, that's a problem. If there is illegal behavior happening online, it needs to be treated as though it was done in person. There need to be ramifications for saying that kind of, death threats and incredibly misogynistic content that females in particular, women of color running for office, have to face by virtue of putting themselves out there. But I don't think that there's a simple technological solution. I think that we need to actually make sure that there is that education, not just for the platforms, not just for the people reading the content, but for the people who are expected to enforce it, as to what the consequences are of not actually addressing those issues. And I think we need to see people call it out. Like, in the meantime, part of that societal thing that makes it okay is it just exists, and then we go, oh, that's the internet, people are crappy. But it needs to be societally unacceptable to act like that, so that women who do step up, that want to speak out online, know that there is support for them doing so, that it's actually something that people want. Because if they're just left to hang out there by themselves and watch themselves torn apart by, hateful people who are looking to perpetuate the status quo, then it is really discouraging. But when you see women like AOC come out there and have people get really excited and defend her, that's something that shows people of color and women of color that they can do that. And I think we need more of that type of societal behavior as opposed to a technological solution. Yes, positive trolls, good frame.
So we've got a question online. Should the media get involved in challenging politicians' promises on wireless, since so many citizens know they're not realistic?
Well, I mean, I would want to ask, which promises are you talking about, and, why are they not realistic necessarily. So for example, let's talk about the Liberal Party's promise. They say that they want to lower prices by 25%, wireless prices by 25% over 4 years. And the industry has already come out and said, well, prices are falling, we've already achieved that. And that's a whole separate discussion altogether. So I'm not sure that there's anything unrealistic there. Maybe you're referring to the NDP promise to institute price caps. And I think that it's difficult because you obviously, like I was saying earlier, you want to remain neutral and you want to remain unbiased, but at the same time, I think it is important for media to be asking questions like, how would this work? Explain this to me. How would you, okay, so the NDP example, they would have the CRTC set rates. Okay, well, how would a rate setting process that's going to take probably, a number of years, how does that keep up with the market? So, it is up to the media to ask these hard questions and to ask politicians to explain what they mean and give the level of detail necessary. And I think that's our job, and that's what I try to do.
Hi, JF. Thank you for your question. The answer is yes, the media should definitely get involved. I think it's not just around politicians' promises on wireless. I think that's the job of the media. Politicians, it's an election. They're promising everything they can to get elected, and they want to make sure you like what they're saying. And we need to know what's realistic, what's something that we can actually hold them accountable to after they're elected. And promises that just say we're going to fix it don't have a lot of substance behind them. And so I think it's definitely the media's job. I will say, as someone who lost their entire Monday to media interviews about the Liberals' plan on cell phones, they're asking those questions. I think the biggest challenge that we have, particularly when it comes to issues around internet policy and things that are discussed by a lot of the CIRA membership, is that these are really complicated issues. They're super technical. I spend half of my time doing media interviews explaining to journalists to make sure they understand the issue before they start asking me questions about it, to make sure that they're able to ask the right questions or get the right answers. And this is because, we can talk about the state of journalism overall. That's a totally different panel discussion. But I think when you look at, someone like Anja, there's not a lot of people who are able to be dedicated to this beat to make sure that it is something they understand through and through. And it's really complicated. And I think it's not just the job of media to hold them accountable, but it's all of our jobs to point out when there are questions to be asked, because I will guarantee you that media are looking to make sure they can see trends popping up and know where they need to poke holes in some of those policies.
And I mean, media in general, there internet issues, telecom, this is what I live and breathe every day, but it's not what most journalists live and breathe every day. So they, the kind of questions that I would ask, I don't think it's realistic to expect them to have that same level of knowledge or to expect them to have the kind of time to devote to asking those questions. So, I can think of so many questions that I would like to know the answers to. For example, the Green Party proposal to strike a parliamentary committee to determine whether we should go ahead with 5G. I would really like to know more. I have lots of questions about that. The NDP is saying that, the Liberal plan to get universal access to the CRTC's basic service standards for everybody in Canada is, 10 years is too long, we would do it faster. How much faster? How would you do that? Lots of questions to be asked that I would like to know the answer to.
Can I ask Anja a question?
Yeah, sure.
Hey, Anja. How hard is it to get answers from the political parties when you have those questions?
That is a good question. Depends on
Do they have answers?
Honestly, sometimes they do. I've been doing a lot of election coverage. I've been, as with every promise, with every platform, I've been kind of digging into it and asking them this question. So far, the NDP has answered my questions. The Liberals have answered my questions. The Green Party did not. I didn't get anybody on the record, but I was able to speak to people on background who were able to answer maybe 50% of my questions. So that's kind of where we're at. But that being said, that means that the majority has been responsive. I was able to get the story out the same day. So.
I was saving this question for last, but you've just thrown me the perfect bone. What should the people in the room, the people online today, what questions should they be asking their candidates in their ridings, the parties? What are the things that the average Canadian should be asking?
Well, since you brought it up, OpenMedia has put forward, we've actually built a tool to let people email their candidates in their ridings directly to ask them whatever you want. So we have put forward the issues that we think are relevant for this election. We've put together a platform for the issues that we think need to be on the table and ways for you to connect with your local candidates. But I would say, don't stop there. Don't take my word for it. If it's an issue that matters to you, this is your chance. This is your time to email them and ask. That's what elections are for. There is no time that they need us more than when they are trying to get a job from us. And so ultimately, this is our best chance to make sure that whatever issue it is, whatever beef you have with your representation, with the policies, with the platforms, this is your chance to raise it. And so I think when we're looking at internet policy issues, there are some issues that are on the record. I think the biggest thing that we should be pressuring the parties and the leaders and the candidates on is where they stand, because it's one thing to pick apart the policy pieces that we know about. It's more concerning to me that they're silent on issues. If no one's talking about privacy, does that mean they don't care, they don't know, or they think I don't care? How do I pressure them to make sure that they're willing to take a position on it so I can make a good judgment? The same thing when it comes to free speech online, the same thing when it comes to connectivity in rural areas. If they haven't talked about it, they don't think you care. And so I think fundamentally it's important for us to make sure that we are pushing them as far as we can, asking all the questions that we need, because in some cases they may not know it's an issue they need to talk about, or they may not have thought about it, and this is really our chance to put it on their radar. Thank you for the pitch.
I would add that email is a great way to start, but showing up and physically being in the same room as the candidates in your riding works really well. So show up and ask them questions about those issues that you do care about. I'm not going to tell you what I think the top issue should be, but I will bring up one that I think is really important, and I think it's this issue of what's the relationship going to be between government and tech companies. And we talked a little bit about this idea of are they publishers or not, but I actually mean the relationship between them, because the major tech companies, they all have staff in Ottawa, and they are both salespeople and lobbyists and community outreach folks. The way that relationship works ends up having a meaningful impact on the way policies get designed that then regulate or don't their activities in Canada. And so I think we need to think more about what we want that relationship to look like, and we need our elected representatives to have thought about that, and when they get in Parliament, be able to think critically about what that relationship should be.
And I'm also not going to, tell you what, what the issues are that you care about. And I think I would just second that. I think, you should be asking them, even if it is, maybe especially if it is something that candidates aren't bringing up themselves. So, I would just say, don't be afraid to bring up issues that you care about. And it's actually something I, tell my reporters, don't be afraid to ask follow-ups. Don't be afraid to ask, well, how come? Why? How would that work? Can you explain that to me? And then, you'll get a fuller response and really be able to make an informed decision about whether that answer is satisfactory.
Great, thanks. And I know there are some questions, and some hands have been up for a long time, but I committed to try to balance getting us back on track and leaving time for questions. So some of our panelists will be here for a glass of wine after, I hope. And if not, as Byron and Helen have mentioned, certainly CIRA staff will be around, and we're pleased to keep answering your questions and keep discussing these issues with you. So on that note, thank you very much to our wonderful panel.